Welcome to an oral history of the University of Laverne, a series created by the students and faculty of Honors 304-351 during Laverne's 125th anniversary year, 2016-2017. I'm Al Clark, Professor of Humanities, and I co-taught this course with Brian Best, Assistant Director of Instructional Technology. This series is based primarily on oral histories contained in the university's archives in Wilson Library. Although some of the footage you will see was professionally filmed, most of the oral histories were shot with amateur equipment and with the intention of transcribing them onto paper, not screening them before audiences. Consequently, the sound and video quality of these oral histories is uneven at best. I personally created this episode of An Oral History of the University of Laverne. It discusses the difficulties that Verne College faced during the Great Depression of the 30s and the Second World War. It shows how President Ellis Studebaker and especially President C. Ernest Davis guided the institution through these difficult years, and how Dr. Davis began the college's revival after 1945. This documentary of the series is entitled Depression, War, and Resurgence. Verne College was located in a wealthy citrus-growing area, suggested by these colorful orange crate labels and the claim to being the heart of the Orange Empire. There were 5 citrus packing houses in Laverne, including the Sunkist House, currently occupied by Enrollment Management Strategic Communications on 1st and E, and the Lemon House, now called the Art and Communication Building. The Laverne Orange and Lemon Cooperative Packing House stood in part where the parking structure now stands and in part where basketball is played in Leo Park. Now isolated in museum-like stands, such as these trees in Sneaky Park, oranges and lemons were so numerous and of such high value in the 1920s and 1930s that their collective income made Los Angeles County the #1 agricultural county in the nation in terms of dollar value of the produce. The college, too, was riding a wave of relative prosperity in the 1920s, having opened the gymnasium in 1921 and Founders Hall in 1926, and receiving preliminary approval for its teacher education program in 1927. Like the sea of trees, Laverne wore orange and green. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties, and some of the good times and prosperity spilled into rural Laverne. The nation's livelihood stood shakily on speculation and income disparity, however, and the economy collapsed in 1929 into the worst economic depression in modern history.
Student enrollment fell, and the building program stopped. For about 20 years after the building of Founders Hall, there was no major construction on the campus of Laverne.
Depression years, clearly faculty were not paid on a regular basis. They frequently missed payrolls. Several years when faculty actually signed their contracts, they signed that they would get at least 60% of what they were signing for. And near the end of the Depression, faculty were accepting IOUs from students who weren't able to pay their tuition but owed tuition, and they owed this tuition then to individual faculty members, quote, when and if they could ever collect it.
Kevork grew grapes wherever he went. He also had goats. That was part of his heritage and his survival techniques. He grew gardens, and he also had small animals, and they would eat those animals, and they survived that depression that way. I find that's also part of the way some of these other families survived too in Laverne. They were pretty much self-sufficient, and that's how they got along without pay and
My father, along with teaching, had 4 orange groves around because he didn't get paid enough at the college. And with 6 children, so he had one up close to Webb School, one down close to, well, about where the baseball field is now, one right beyond our house, and one behind our house. So he would, when he wasn't teaching, he was always working in the grove.
My brothers, there was no thought of college for them because it was deep depression. So they all, one brother went to college. But suddenly it seemed that here was word about 2 weeks before school started that I could go to college, to Verne College. And I couldn't afford to be in the dorm, so the Rensburgers, who had a house, the house is still there right across from the church, the old two-story house, they let my friend and me live with them. We did our own cooking, which wasn't always very good.
Mary Hunter arrived at Laverne in fall 1929, just before the American stock market crashed, commencing a free fall into an economic abyss. Like many of her schoolmates, she had to work to pay for school in those Depression years, and what she earned wasn't enough.
Doing housework for people at the beach, taking care of children and doing housework, and I still did that almost all through college. $4 or $5 for the weekend I would get.
Wow.
And so that took care of a lot of the fun things. So I didn't study as much as I should have. Seemed like the papers were always due on Monday, and I worked until Sunday afternoon. College debt. Can you imagine a college debt of $126 for my last year? That was about what the last year cost. And I said I won't get married until I get that paid. Mm. And jobs were very hard to get. So I worked at this and that for a year before we got married.
One of Mary Hunter's favorite teachers was Dorothy Merritt, as she had been for Lois Miller before her and would be for Doris Frick a decade later.
Dorothy Merritt? Oh, she was glorious. And did we have a good time? We put on an operetta. She made up the words and I made up the music.
She became the literature and physical education teacher. And when she came, we had physical education. And also lots of poetry, learning of poetry of different centuries. That's where I learned to appreciate poetry.
Dorothy did a lot of drama. She could teach anything. They learned to ski when they were 50.
Oh, really?
She played tennis, and so she taught all these things. She taught art and psychology. I mean, she just try anything.
Another dear faculty member was longtime Dean W.I.T. Hoover.
We have Dr. W.I.T. Hoover, William Isaac Thomas Hoover, and we just loved him. My friend Harriet and I would walk to his classes. We just loved his classes. And we were always a little bit late, going in out of breath, you know. And he'd say, "Now, Mary and Harriet, I know you hurry to get here, but you're going to have to start hurrying a little earlier every day." He taught philosophy.
Oh.
And my husband just loved him. He was our favorite professor, and we had him marry us, perform the ceremony.
Oh. The same stack of jokes year after year. Isn't that what everybody says? And of course it was always Miss Miller, Miss Brubaker, but when Lois and Lois Ruth Miller, happened to be in the same class, he finally had to say Miss Lois Ruth, Miss Lois, or Miss Ruth.
The Laverne Church of the Brethren Sanctuary was constructed while Mary Hunter was a student at Verne College, and conservative church teaching set the tone for students and faculty alike during the dark decade of economic depression and the rise of dictatorships in Europe and Asia.
When we signed our applications, we didn't smoke or drink or dance
Oh.
play cards. Those were bad things. Good brethren didn't do that. We were required to take Bible classes and to go to chapel.
Oh.
And in chapel we had assigned seats.
Oh.
And so when I was a sophomore in this class, there was this nice young man sitting next to me, and we were the only two in class. And we ended up being married for 64 years.
In his time at Laverne, Kevork dealt with what he spoke of in his book here, problems not being Church of the Brethren. Mm. They would send pastors to try to influence Kevork to convert or perhaps leave. And so the pressure was unrelenting, and finally in 1934 he submitted his resignation from Laverne.
Wow.
And he had a job lined up at Fullerton Junior College, and he moved his family down to Fullerton for the school year 1935-36.
Dr. Sarafian might also have left because of financial concern.
One of his most shining moments, one that's part of family lore, and it's also in his book From Immigrant to Educator, which is his autobiography, was keeping the college open with a number of core faculty in 1933. At the end of the year, President Studebaker brought in Edgar Rothrock, who was the Board of Trustee president. They had a joint meeting of the Board of Trustees and the faculty. And they said, we probably need to shut down the college. We don't have the money to pay you. But Kevork was asked first whether that was a good idea or not by Edgar Rothrock. Kevork gave an impassioned speech that stuck with him, and he remembered it, and he said, I believe in the college. I believe we are altruistic enough to keep the school open, even if we're not paid, until it gains its financial footing. This place is important enough to keep open. If we close it, I doubt that it'll start again, or at least we'll lose great momentum. And so the faculty voted. It was unanimous to keep the college open at the end of 1933. You know, they didn't get paid again till December of 1934. The students wrote IOU notes.
Wow.
And of course they couldn't pay, but the IOU notes didn't translate into anything more than worthless script for these teachers. They actually gave their IOU notes to the teachers. So it followed that there was quite a bit of disharmony in the faculty as they realized they weren't getting paid, and this dragged on. It was one thing to vote that will accept IOUs, but it was another thing to continue. So somewhere into 1934, they actually gathered as a faculty to have a vote of no confidence against President Studebaker and against the business manager. They felt that they were not pulling their weight and reversing the college's fortune. And again, Kevork says that he talked him out of it. He said, let's fire the business manager because I think he is not doing his job, but President Studebaker is a worthwhile person and he's trying. And so they actually voted to oust President Studebaker, but then they voted again after Kevork spoke to keep him.
At that time, if you were married, you didn't get a job.
Oh, because of the Depression.
So,
On account of this widespread practice in America's Depression workplace, Mary Hunter had to choose between getting married and going to work, and the popular faculty member Dorothy Merritt was fired because her husband worked full-time at Pomona College. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarafian's departure left Laverne's teacher education program in limbo.
we did not have good education courses. And one principal to whom I applied for a job later on said, you know, we hire a lot of people from Verne College. He said, they don't always know much about teaching, but they're such wonderful people. I'd like to have you on my staff.
Alice Studebaker, because he was a gentleman of the old school, and of course a scholar. He had taught at McPherson College, a man ahead of his era in a way. He wanted to branch out a little more in educational field, where some of the church members who were of a much more conservative nature, you see.
One day, there was a knock on the door, and President Studebaker surprised him, apologized for the Church of the Brethren, begged him to come back, and Kevork said, why? And he said, because we're having problems with our teacher accreditation.
Under Dr. Sarafian's guidance and with Dr. Studebaker's support, Laverne's teacher education program achieved full accreditation in its own right in 1938. Within a decade, the reputation of Laverne's teacher education program was one of the highest in Southern California.
The reputation for Laverne teachers was outstanding.
Gladys Muir, another popular teacher, took advantage of the violence of the 1930s to teach Laverne students about peace.
One of the effects was to widen the horizon of the students as their attention was focused on the International Science Club in 1931. And shortly afterwards, for the first time, a course in international relations was given in the college curriculum.
A professor called Gladys Muir, who at that time was considered an outstanding history professor, and she had a group of fellows, all good students, who would get together and discuss with her. We did a lot of reading, Power of Nonviolence with Greg, and studying the life of Gandhi and a lot of other leaders. This was before the war, and in fact, across America, there was quite a strong peace movement in all colleges and really in all denominations. But when right at the time we entered into the war, there is always considerable pressure, but I had determined as near as I could what I believed and was planning to follow through.
In 1938, Ellis Studebaker, exhausted by keeping the college afloat, submitted his resignation. Studebaker, whose 15 years tenure as president had begun in the prosperous 1920s, had been shaken by the difficult times that the 1930s brought. He was replaced by an alumnus and former faculty member of Lordsburg and Laverne, C. Ernest Davis, who came with an immense amount of practical experience in administration. While enrollments were improving, the new president would soon be tested by the depletion of college men by the wartime draft.
He felt like the previous president had stayed much too long.
Oh.
So when he came, he said, I'm going to stay for 10 years. Now, he didn't know what he was walking into. It was right at the end of the Depression. The college was heavily in debt. It needed a real boost. The buildings were old. It needed to expand, but there was virtually no money. They needed to operate. Teachers were leaving because they hadn't been paid.
Right.
And he was the right person to bring because he knew everybody in Northern California and Washington.
Ah.
Okay?
Right.
He knew all those people. He knew the college. He had been there as a teacher, in a sense. And he was known all over the Brotherhood by being in Mount Morris, being in the Central Park, plus the fact he was very careful about spending money and what he did. Because he had to grow up that way. And then the war came along.
Right. Just took over.
And all the men were gone. And all the other people were out working. And he's lost staff and everything. But
Perhaps the best way to sketch the shortages and the pleasures of the Second World War years at Verne College and in the city of Laverne is to let 4 students tell their recollections of the time. Imogene Hanawalt, class of 1943, Mildred Davis, class of 1946, Doris Frick, class of 1948, and Darrell Brandt, class of 1952.
Our doors were open during the day, but
Closed.
locked at 10 o'clock at night. But Dwight and his friends knew how to take the doors off the hinges.
Oh, Dwight did that too, huh? So he knew how to do it even before he was dean of men.
He knew the tricks.
Oh.
And he climbed up the vines on Miller Hall to our room for my birthday party once. After he graduated, he taught for 3 months and then was drafted, but he was a conscientious objector and he ended up in Puerto Rico. Dwight and I both went to college, courtesy of our uncles. My Uncle Roy and his Uncle Jesse had not been paid because the college couldn't afford to pay them in the bad years. So we went to school and we paid the uncles, thereby making up their own salary. A dining room, that was called a dining club.
Oh, a dining club?
And It was just organized with students.
Oh.
It wasn't of the college. It was students who organized together and hired a cook. We slept out on the sleeping porches at the Miller Hall then, and we could hear the sirens and all that. And we often were made to go down into the basement and sit on the floor through an air raid
Drill, huh?
threat. There was only one car on campus, and that belonged to Kenny Schamberger.
Oh.
And so occasionally we would pile into his car and go to the movie or something.
Men were almost nil. There were a few there that were 4Fs or studying to be ministers. They got exempt. We had some sports, believe it or not. One of the gals that was really into sports made up a football team.
Made up a football team?
All women.
Oh.
And it was tag football.
Oh, I see.
I did not play that football. I was involved in some badminton. We had parties. I announced my engagement to Chuck in the dorm room.
Oh.
I hid my engagement ring in a cake. We hiked to the L in those days. And we had deputation teams.
Oh.
And they would go up through the valley, give programs at churches, talk about Verne College, and try to raise a little money, that kind of thing. Filled up a whole sedan. It was like 5 plus the driver in people's homes. Yeah, they invited us to their homes, fed us wonderful meals, and it was the recruiting guy that did the driving. Compare the colleges, the university down the college when I went. My goodness, it was like a family. You knew everybody. You were close friends with most of them. That's the way it was. And there was, I should have looked that up, but there was like 19 in my graduating class when I was graduating from college.
This was during the war, that there were not enough workers to do the picking and so forth, and so we had prisoners of war who were stationed at the fairgrounds. And they came and they were doing the picking, but I remember helping to haul the fruit to the packing house, and it had rained and it was wet, so the grove was not easy to get through, and then we especially, when we filled the truck up, it had to come up to the road, and it stuck and went clear down.
Oh no.
It had all this weight of fruit on it, and what are we going to do? And we didn't have any tractor close by or whatever, but all the prisoners, they just went over there and they just pushed that truck right out.
Oh, wow.
And no big deal. We did that with tanks.
Yeah.
Small college. There were only 3 boys in my freshman class
Because of the war.
because of the war.
Wow.
And then this next year, that my sophomore year, there was still, the war was still going, and there wasn't much going on. But my freshman year, I sang in the women's choir, and I sang in the chapel choir, and I sang in a quartet. There was a complete change at the university because all of these kids came back. Instead of having three boys in my class, there was all these boys.
In preparing this video, I'd like to acknowledge the continued help from my colleagues Brian Best, Ben Jenkins, and William Neal, and also all the many people who sat for oral history interviews as I worked on this project. I'd like to thank the archives for allowing me to use films in the collection, many of them created by Bill Neal, and I'd like especially to thank those people who were interviewed and whose interviews were used in this segment of an oral history of the University of La Verne. They include Mary Hunter Bowman, Darrell Brandt, Charles and Millie Davis, Doris Frick, Imogene Hanawalt, and George Keeler. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that some of the illustrations in this documentary came from books by Herbert Hoagland and Gladys Muir.